Hello, and welcome to this, the 11th installment of the PASS Facebook Live Pop-Up Expert Series. In this session, you'll have the opportunity to ask me any of your data privacy, compliance, and GDPR related questions in this real-time live Q&A. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please type it into the comment section below now, and they'll appear on screen as I answer them. So first of all, an introduction. My name's Richard Macaskill. I'm a product manager for Redgate software. And I guess the reason I've been asked to do this session is because I've been working on to help bring some products to market for Redgate in the past 3 years that have been used very much to improve the data privacy practices of our customers' organizations. So we had a SQL clone delivering virtualized copies of database under a management of a database administrator, enabling fast dev test cycles, but also enabling control over where the environments were created. We added to that data masker for SQL Server, and currently I'm working on bringing to market a SQL data catalog that's fit for the sort of current age of data classification for the sake of privacy and protection of the data that we manage as data professionals. So while I'm not hugely comfortable with the sort of pop-up expert tag, I think the reason I've been asked is because I've probably spent more time speaking to data professionals about data protection in the last few years than most have. So hopefully I can share some of the things that I've learned from our customers and from an awful lot of conversations with an awful lot of data professionals and also governance experts. So we spent a fair bit of time attending some of the early conferences around GDPR with some of the people who are involved in drafting the law and the people involved in implementing it, and the regulators and compliance experts around that space as well. Prior to working for Redgate, I worked in financial services, so I do have some first-hand experience of not just working in a regulated environment, but going from an environment that was less regulated to one that was much more regulated. And I think I see there are a lot of parallels around what's happening just now in data and what's happened previously in other regulated areas like healthcare, financial services, and so on. Okay, so that's me. Hopefully there'll be some interest in, and I'll be able to bring some of the experience that we've gained in answering some of your questions. So just waiting for the first questions to pop up, and yeah, please do just pop your questions in the box you'll see below. We've got one. So, what have been the biggest impacts of the GDPR on database teams? Okay, so that's an interesting one. I've spent, as I say, most days I'm talking to people in data teams, sometimes multiple teams, and who are experiencing this sort of changed environment. I think to get to the point, the biggest impact, I think, is the amount of communication that they have to do with their peers. Sometimes people that they only had a sort of passing acquaintance with. For example, just yesterday I was in Manchester at a customer site with the database administrators who are all familiar with Redgate products. They're all SQL Server database administrators, and a data governance team, the governance team who were, and then they were really just getting to know each other. And there's an awful lot of that going on at the moment. Governance teams operating without speaking to the data teams taking things off their own, on their own initiative, because they can see that they're intimately involved in complying with GDPR, in raising the game, but also in communicating what they're doing to protect data. So I think more conversations, a bigger stakeholder group, and different types of conversations with the other people in your organization is probably the biggest change that I've seen so far in these last few years. That answers that question. Oh, okay. What database development techniques will make me compliant? There's a kind of I don't know if there's a kind of a trick there in the sense that you could be compliant with an awful lot of different database development techniques. The question is, could you be productive as well? Could you also deliver the other things that your organization needs? I think it becomes increasingly difficult to be compliant and deliver the pace of change, the well-tested change, change that's iterative and small. But there are a few standouts, of course. Working on copies that have not being uncompliant is I guess the key here. So if you're in a GDPR regulated environment, for example, and you find yourself working on a development copy of some personal data that's personally identifiable in the context that it can be used to identify, in the words of the GDPR, natural living subject, then the best thing you can do, probably ask some questions of others of your organization. Do I need to see this? Is this the purpose for which this data was provided? So I think asking questions and looking around you is the most important technique. Once you've identified that this might not be ideal, or that there might be an issue with where data sits, what is being done with it, then hopefully you'll get to a position in your organization where you can help start solving those problems. And of course, for working with data in outside production, you probably want to do things like masking or generating of data. I'd reach out to those as some of the sort of key techniques, but also under the umbrella of DevOps, doing things in a repeatable way. If your method of deploying database change, for example, is consistent and repeatable, then you will be gathering artifacts, information, logs that you can use to help improve what you're doing. If it's ad hoc, scattergun, you can't quite remember exactly how you got that change over the line last time, and you hope you can remember this time. You'll be less able to sort of to improve it, to use the feedback loop in the DevOps sense to improve your own practices, to make the production line of database change a better production line. You've really got to have one in the first place. So if you're doing nothing around source control, nothing around continuous integration and deployment, then I'd say please do consider that. But first of all, look around and see whether the spirit of data privacy is being observed. Oh, okay, I've got a curveball. What would you tackle first if you were in charge of data protection at Redgate? I'm not going to say data masking or even DevOps or data protection software. I think the first thing someone in charge with responsibility you would have to do at any organization really is to find out that you've got executive buy-in, that your organization wants to do the right things, even no matter how far away it is from being perfect. And everyone's some degree away from being perfect. You have to make sure that you've got the right level of buy-in. I think I would tackle first is cultural. Check for alignment around the organization. Maybe demand, see what happens if you demand 5 minutes at the next board meeting. Do you get rebuffed? Do you get laughed at, or do you get the seat? I think the culture is the first thing to check on. Someone's been watching the other webinars. Yesterday's webinar talked about Compliant Database DevOps. Aren't compliance and DevOps two separate things? They are, of course. I'm tempted with some corny tagline, two different things that are better together. But to answer the question more seriously, you can be compliant without implementing DevOps process, whatever the principles, the spirit, the approach to doing things that we describe under DevOps. You can be compliant without doing DevOps, and you can do DevOps without being compliant. However, you can use one to reinforce and improve the other. In my view, and in the view that obviously Redgate is using that as something of a tagline at the moment. But you can use this opportunity for business transformation, the impetus that we're getting from concern about the data breach epidemic, that from regulatory change, for example. As a data professional, we think that you may well have an opportunity to improve your practices across the board. And that's happening for so many people that we're talking to, or household names that I suspect most of us would know, who are grasping this opportunity and saying, we've never been all that repeatable, we've never been looking at our processes and cutting down our, and doing the things we always wanted to do under the banner of DevOps. Now that we're being asked to be more compliant, we can raise our game across the board. It's very common to join the two things together, and you can effectively, I believe, make your processes more compliant and effective at the same time. Just waiting for the next question to pop up. Okay, fake data or not. This one's been rumbling for many years, of course. So the full question I should read out is: some people say that only completely fake data should ever be used outside of prod. What do you think? I think that's not always the case, but it is sometimes the case. I think there are scenarios where the data has to be generated. There are scenarios in which there is just too much risk attached to taking any other approach. However, the risk assessments may well lead you to a place where the best way of ensuring the quality of your software is to use data that didn't start out fake, but acquired enough fakeness, so to speak, for the balance of risk to be right. If you're not properly testing your software because you don't have data available, because each developer is responsible for mocking out or writing a little test harness with a handful of data points in it, you're running risk of delivering software that doesn't operate in the expected way, and that risk may. That's mostly normally a risk to the company or to its customers, but it's I think it's perfectly reasonable to say that can outweigh the risk that you're taking from using data that's originated in the real world. Real world databases, if you look into a database, especially a kind of operational data store, or the one of these databases that's the model of the business that it's operating for, it's like going on an architectural dig. There are things that you'll find in there that you would not expect to find. The data quality probably varies in consistency a great deal, because schemas outlive applications. The schemas typically are around for 20, 30 years. I've worked on schemas that were 30 years old, that go back to the very early days of the relational database and even beyond. So replicating that kind of profile is incredibly difficult. And there's good history of using production derived data. If you look at people like Dave Harley at the LMAX, the kind of some people wrote the book on continuous delivery, on the practices that we now label DevOps. They were copying production data. I understand from a conference I attended, Dave Harley described how they used to copy down the production data. I think it was at the LMAX exchange. It's got a long history. It has to be done with care, but it can, as a balanced risk, part of a balanced risk approach, be the right thing to do in many circumstances, to use production derived data. Just on the subject of risk, I mean, that's what it's. We can sometimes forget that it's not about observing rule A or rule B as much as it is complying with the GDPR. That is, as much as it is about taking a risk-balanced approach to handling data. The word risk is used, I think, something like 60 times in the text of the GDPR. It is, if anything, a sort of manifesto to assess and consider what risks we're taking, and then to bring them under management and control. I hope that answers that question sufficiently. Okay, have you been involved in any data privacy horror stories yourself? Not big picture, no. However, I will hold my hand up. I've been guilty of the old BCC contents going into the CC field. I guess that's quite a horror story when it happened. I was working for a hedge fund, and it was an investor newsletter, and there were some thousands of investors and interested parties who would probably recognized each other's email addresses, wouldn't necessarily know each other were investors. It was quite horrific at the time. I was able to hold my hands up, and I was to some degree, I think, forgiven by the people in charge. We did change our practices, though. First, and you see these stories in the news every now and then. Somebody's CC. There's been a few recently in the UK. There was one about some very vulnerable patients, and sensitive patient information was CC'd rather than BCC'd. And I don't think there's really much excuse for that, given how easy it is to get hold of software that can handle your mailing practices. I think there's beyond, and once you're operating at any kind of a scale, I think you do have to use the right tools for the job. And Outlook's BCC field is almost certainly not the right tool for the job. So I'm not blaming the tools, I'm blaming myself. But we improved our practices, and I think that's every sort of close brush that you come across. I think if you improve your practices, then I think that's possibly in some circumstances understandable. Okay. Next question we've got. So, what are the steps you take in the event of a data breach? If I discovered one at work, I would find the most senior person responsible that I could. If there was a specialist in charge of data governance, data protection, if there's a data protection officer, obviously I'd get hold of that person as soon as possible. I think the first thing to do also is remembering that we've in the UK, under the guidance of the Information Commissioner's Office, that we have 72 hours to respond to notify of a data breach event. I would gather as much information as quickly as I could about the extent of the data breach. So number of records affected, number of systems affected, number and sensitivity of data, which of course is why it's so important to classify your data. It can take an awful lot of time to figure out, if you're doing it completely cold, whether the loss of a particular database or the unauthorized access to a particular system, whether that's is it a bad day at the office, is it a very bad day at the office, or is this an existential threat to your organization? And you should care about the people as well. What impact will this have on the people who might be identified in this data breach? Hopefully I would have enough information beforehand in order to give my organization, and then very quickly the regulator, and then very quickly also the public, an accurate description of what I think the impact was. And if I hadn't done that ahead of time, I would be scrambling as best I could to do that. Yeah, ideally I would access my data catalog or my records of some kind, and I would take those to the responsible parties in my organization and start preparing a report. I'd probably cancel anything that I had planned for the next couple of days, that's for sure. But I think assessing the extent while somebody else I'm thinking, putting myself in the shoes of a database administrator or professional, where perhaps somebody else is looking at the closing the cause of the breach. Of course, if I was able to do that, I would do so as well. So find the cause, but if somebody else is working on that, find the extent, prepare the report, and start to have in mind what the mitigations, what the remediations might be. Oh, this is a very okay. The next question is, what states have their own data privacy laws, and how do they differ? I cannot answer this. I'm assuming that the questioner means which states of the United States have their own data privacy laws. If it means what states internationally, I think I'll take it as that. There's a lot of variation inside the United States, of course. When we see Washington State recently enacted some legislation, we see the California Consumer Privacy Act undergoing modification prior to going live at the beginning of next year. So we don't know what's exactly is going to happen there. In New York State, we have the SHIELD Act is also under scrutiny in development. I believe there are certainly many others. We've seen the internationally, we've seen the responses to GDPR. We're very quick from Japan. And we've seen already, you could argue that precursor to GDPR, we had a quite strong regulation in Canada. So there's, how do they differ is a question that your lawyer will bill you for a couple of weeks if you really want the full answer to that question. But there's a common theme emerging in those in the recent regulations. One of the themes is the concentration on the rights of the subject. So the game has changed to quite some degree. The sense that this is my data, I collected it, therefore it's mine, is being challenged by the law and by the regulator. Your obligation to the rights of the data subject are normally foremost, unless they're superseded by some normal contractual obligation, or by a criminal or state body organization. But so there's the commonality, I think, is more important to observe initially, in that you are being expected as a data professional to uphold the spirit of the law and uphold the rights of the data subject. And then when you're looking at very specific measures that you're taking in order to enforce that spirit, I think then you need to start looking at what the very local jurisdictions that you're working under are telling you. Which, as a slight segue, is another reason I would say that it's, while it's good and helpful to classify your data as sensitive or non-sensitive, and it's helpful to say that it is this information type or another, to fully underpin the technical policy that you're implementing or the remediation work that you're doing, you normally need to go a bit further. So is this particular data subject to HIPAA and GDPR, or CCPA and some other regulation? You need to be able to capture a richness in the way that you classify your data, in order to really benefit from what we can do now with data classification. The time's flying by. I think maybe got time for one more question there. What are your predictions for the future in terms of database development trends and data protection laws? I think I can. Predictions are dangerous, but I can certainly speak to some of the things that we're seeing happening and would expect to see more of. We're seeing data protection being built into database development practices. So it's becoming much more normal to have the sense that this is a modified data set. I think data management of data sets is moving on and is becoming more commonplace, where it used to be sort of the domain of perhaps very wealthy organizations or systematic traders, quant analysts, and so on would be able to work with large data sets that were slightly varied or slightly protected or masked. I think that is becoming commonplace, and I think it will become expected to some degree in the same way that other management of permissions and other common data protection practices have become expected. For the law, I think we're experiencing possibly the quiet before the storm on GDPR. Obviously, the big fights have not yet been played out. But also from talking to the regulators, certainly in the UK, they're working with a huge number of cases, and they started working on a large number of cases at a similar time, and they expect them to start coming through to public attention and to fines fairly soon. So, and it's hard to escape the observation that once data protection has been improved in a jurisdiction, then the rising tide does tend to raise all boats. That there's a certain amount that will happen through people tackling contract risk, looking at the number of people I can do business with. The pool of possible business may diminish if you're not implementing or at least able to describe what you're doing around correctly managing the data that you hold. So I think the data protection law will continue to be rights-based and will continue to push people forwards in protecting the data, improving their practices in a way that's that they can evidence, that they can describe to a due diligence committee, a regulator if they need to, law enforcement if they need to. We're no longer sort of behind the curtain. We say as data professionals, we can't say leave it to us. We've got this. We need to be able to describe what we're doing, why we make those decisions, and check whether we can improve. So I think it's only going in one direction: more protection and better control of what we do, better scrutiny of how we can improve it. I think we're almost out of time. There are some more PASS events coming up. So thank you very much for joining and participating. Great questions there. There is a great lineup of experts planned for future events. So be sure to follow the PASS Facebook page for updates and details of upcoming sessions just like this. Of course, if you're not already a member, you can join PASS by heading over to pass.org and creating your profile today. It's free, and it's a great place for data professionals to connect, share, and learn. You'll get invitations to things like this, to all sorts of sessions and events. Redgate very much enjoys being part of the PASS community. It gives us a platform to speak to each other as data professionals, without it just being a sort of vendor-customer sort of relationship. We are a community of professionals as well. And if you're interested in continuing your learning around data privacy and compliance, do join us tomorrow for the upcoming PASS Marathon event with PASS and Redgate as part of our co-hosted Data Privacy Week. It's a 5-session back-to-back webinar, and you'll learn what's happened since GDPR came into force and understand how PASS itself achieved compliance. And if I remember correctly, Redgate were part of that story, but with US legislation as well as the GDPR. And Redgate will also be sharing the latest white paper from Redgate, the Global Data Privacy Roadmap, on Friday. So keep an eye out for more details on that. thank you very much again for joining me, and thank you for Pass for inviting me to answer some of these questions. I hope I did okay, and maybe help keep the debate going. And I'll sign out there. Thanks very much.